The second series of ethical models that we're going to deal with are actually deontological ethical models. So what does that mean? It means that the way these models determine whether something, an action or decision is ethical, is based upon a different criteria. Rather than looking at the consequences or the ends, like we did in the previous two models of ethical egoism and utilitarianism, this time we're going to judge something based upon what it is that you actually do, not what happens as a result of what you do. So it's a fundamentally different way of judging whether something's ethical. We're going to look at two particular approaches to it. They're classic approaches. One from Immanuel Kant, and the second will be the rights approach. We're going to deal with Kant in more detail because I think it provides a logical analytical technique, and it's also one of the most widely used and quoted approaches to a deontological approach. We'll touch on the human rights approach, the rights-based approach to ethics, because it is so prevalent in society, but we'll deal with that more in a surface level. And the reason for that I'll go into when we get to it. It has to do with a couple of the limitations to that approach. Okay, so let's start off by having a look at Kant's approach. So as we can see, a key differentiator is that consequentialist approaches don't consider the nature of the act. They only consider the outcome. In contrast, when we use these deontological theories, they're going to suggest that intention matters. Okay, you should look at this. You should ignore the consequences of the action. It's what you're trying to do, and it comes from the Greek duty. Right, you have a duty to be ethical, and that it's possible to determine what you're morally obliged to do, what your duty is, by working out how to act based on that duty. There's a couple of core concepts that underlie Kant's approach to ethics. One of them is this issue of goodwill, or the idea that your intention matters. So it's not goodwill, like how much a business is worth, and it's not wishing well to other people, goodwill. He's using goodwill here to actually mean your intention. Okay, what do you intend to actually do? The second thing that I think we've got to recognize around Kant is when Kant is thinking about this. So if you go back to in this period of time, what you find is that moral authority was generally given in various societies, but we're particularly talking about the European approach here, came from the church. And how did you work out what you should do? What was the moral or ethical thing to do? Well, it was what the priest told you to do. Because a lot of people couldn't even read, even if they wanted to inspect the text, like the Bible in this case, to work it out for themselves. At the same time, we see this rise throughout society in the use of reason and intellect and the importance of reason and intellect. So what Kant does, and why it was considered such a paradigm shift, is he's trying to shift away from the moral authority being given to us by church into a different paradigm where you can work it out for yourself through reason. And that's the key kind of breakthrough. And he comes up with a way of doing that, of using reason to work out what we should do. So again, Kant is worried about goodwill, what you intend to do, regardless of the consequences. Even if you consistently get bad consequences, you could still be acting morally. Really interestingly, it's not what you do, it's your motivation. So imagine we've got two people doing exactly the same thing. Kant would say, if person A is doing it because they see it as the right thing to do, that is, they're doing it with good will, then they're acting ethically. But if person B is just doing it without thinking about it, then Kant would say B is not acting ethically, even though they're doing exactly the same thing. Okay, goodwill, central to Kant's approach. Central to Kant's idea is the concept of the categorical imperative. So he's saying that there are rules that are imperative, right, that you have to do them, right? That there's an imperative. Ethically, you have to do them. And that they're categorical. You do them or you don't, right? You must do them all the time. So there's a category of things that you have to do. He also thought that you could work that out through reason. Okay, you can work it out from first principles. The first principle that he had in his categorical imperative was that you should only do things that could become a universal law. This really means your will or what you want to have happen needs to be consistent. It needs to make sense in all situations all the time, because if it doesn't, then you're not being rational. So to work out whether something was universal, whether it would be a universal law, Kant uses several different approaches. We're going to concentrate on the two most used and most important ones. They get us a long way to understanding Kant's approach for this subject, BSB151. Okay, the first one that we have to deal with is universal acceptability. The second one is respect. So let's get into those particular ways of thinking about whether something's ethical or not. Universal acceptability means that whatever we want to do needs to be able to be expressed as a general rule or maxim that would allow us to take a proposed action. So we take the general act that we want to do and see if we can come up with a rule or a maxim that would allow us to do that in all situations all the time. So the example here we have from business is you want to breach a contract. May I say it might increase your profits. Then you could turn that into a generalized or universal rule, like everyone can breach contracts. We can then see that the maxim is inconsistent and contradictory. Because a contract is a legally binding agreement, if it's ethically okay to breach it when it doesn't suit us, then the whole concept of a contract is undermined. It's a contradiction in conception, right? A contract doesn't make sense if you can breach it. Because the whole point of a contract is you can't break it. And if it's ethically okay to break it, then what's the meaning of a contract? Okay, it's a contradiction in the conception of what a contract is. Now, sometimes we might get a rule which is not a strict contradiction in conception, but it can be a contradiction in will. A contradiction in will is a rule that if it was universalized, no one would really want to live in a world where that was the case. Even if it's not kind of illogical in the way that a contradiction in conception is, it's not the kind of world that a free-thinking, rational being would want to live in. What's one that might work? Probably one that's close to that is something like, no, it's okay not to give to charity, right? So if no one ever gave to charity, would you really want to live in a world where no one helped other people out? There's nothing illogical about that, but maybe you wouldn't want to live in a world like that. So that's an example of a contradiction in will. The second formulation of the categorical imperative we're going to deal with is treating others with respect, okay? Not as a means of getting what you want. So you have to treat people as an end in themselves. Put another way, don't use people, okay? If what you're doing is just using someone, it's unethical. So a key argument here is that rational beings want to be respected and treated with dignity and allowed to pursue their own goals. That means we should treat people that way, not just as a way of getting what we want. So let's consider an example like desiring sex with a partner. What a way to put it. Anyway, okay. On the one hand, you can treat a partner as a means to your ends, so to speak, right? Because you want to have sex, so you're just going to use them to have sex. On the other, you can treat the partner with respect and seek a mutually beneficial encounter. Notice here, it's about the goodwill, the intent. It's not about the consequences. This doesn't say, do people feel hurt or angry or whatever at the end. We're not worried about the consequences. We're worried about what you're thinking in the act. Notice it doesn't matter about the act either. In both situations, you could have exactly the same act, exactly the same consequences. What has shifted is the person's mental reference in carrying out the act. What was your goodwill? Was it to use the person? Or was it to respect their ends, what they want, as well as what you want at the same time? Right? That can be a bit of a tricky concept to get your head around at first. Like you say, let's use something a bit more mundane in business, that you want to order a meal at a restaurant. Like if you order from a wait staff, are you treating them with respect or not? Because you're making them go get you something. Well, it all depends, right? That's a job. They choose to do it, etc. It all depends how you enact with it. Is it part of a mutually beneficial exchange? Or are you just treating them to go get you your food as a means of getting what you want? That's the key to understanding this element of Kant. Well, Kant in general, it's about this goodwill. Actually, the business example we have here is how you treat customers. Do you treat them as a way of making profit or as a way of getting a mutually beneficial exchange? Same kind of thing. So we can see the reflection of Kant in most major religions. I won't go through them all, I'll leave you to read them, but essentially treat others as you would like to be treated. So it seems to be a fairly universal way to think about how we deal with others through all the major religions, and Kant's just incorporating it into this logic and saying we need to do this because that's how a rational being would want to be treated. So a Kantian analysis of a problem is actually reasonably simple, but it's hard to do. Okay, so the steps are simple and fairly straightforward, but the thinking behind it is one that students struggle with the most. So what do you have to do? Well, you have to first isolate what is the act or decision that is ethically questionable. Like, what does someone want to do? They want to steal this bread, say, right? So they want to steal this bread. So then you need to work out a rule that would allow them to do that act. Okay, so let's say a general rule would be it's okay to steal. Okay, if it's morally okay to steal, you can steal that bread. So I've taken the specific act and I've generalized it. Okay. Now I take that generalization and I say, hey, is there a contradiction in conception or a contradiction in will in that? And actually, like it's okay to steal would be a contradiction in conception, right? Because if it's ethically okay to steal, well, then that means that people really don't own anything, if that makes sense, right? How can you own something that people are allowed to steal? The whole point of ownership is you have exclusive rights. And if someone is ethically able to take it from you, you don't have those rights. And if you don't own something, then stealing doesn't make any sense. You can only steal something that someone else owns, right? Okay, think about that. Contradiction in conception. Probably a contradiction in will. Would you want to live in a world where no one could own anything? You'd never own anything. A lot of people would say no to that. Some people might say yes. A lot of people would say no. Contradiction in will. Is stealing treating people with respect? No. You're taking their stuff, right? You're stealing it. So no, you're not treating people with respect. So if it fails any, not all, any of those tests, if it fails any of those tests, Kant says, unethical, you can't do it. That's the Kantian approach to working it out. So in summary, Kant wants us to work out whether our action or decision could be made into a categorical imperative. How do you work that out? Work this out. You work out whether it's universal, whether it's respectful. Remember, with universal, we have a contradiction in conception and a contradiction in will. He further believed that different formulations were versions of the same principle, right? The same underlying principle of acting with goodwill, but that sometimes these lenses gave us a different view to see the problem more clearly. So one of the major critiques of Kant's approach to ethics is really that it's very strict and inflexible. There's a number of dimensions to that inflexibility. The first is really a sense of duty the only way to act ethically? What about something like a feeling like compassion? And we know from our broader model that we dealt with in week 1 that feelings come into play when people make ethical decisions or take ethical actions. Are you really less moral because you act out of compassion? Because remember, Kant's underlying view, it's only when you act out of this sense of duty that you can be ethical. Any other motivation isn't ethical. Okay, so that's why they're saying it's very strict. Also, it's strict in the sense of the application of the categorical imperative. So for instance, you would never be able to lie under Kant's categorical imperative. Even if it could save someone's life, have a hugely positive ethical outcome, Kant would say you can't do it. Okay, so if you can't, because you can't have exceptions to the maxim. And we can talk about that a little bit more when we get together in the group, but that's a very important implication of Kant, is how strict it is if we're going to have a universal rule. Finally, one of the problems that comes up with all of these duty-based approaches is it doesn't resolve conflicts between duties. Okay, so for instance, I have a duty not to lie, and I ought not let someone be killed. But what do I do if leading to the truth leads to someone being killed? Right? Often the problems with these duty-based approaches is it doesn't tell you how to resolve the problems of a conflict of duties. That's it. That's Kant's approach, a major approach to ethics that we still use in business. Anytime you see a code of conduct, those kind of things, they're really basing it on this idea of Kant's approach about the way you should do something rather than the consequences of what you should do. So it has a huge impact on the business environment and society. Maybe not as strictly and as theoretically as Kant puts it here, but this gives us a good basis for something to examine to understand that core concept. The next little video is going to deal briefly with another area of deontological ethics, which is moral rights theory.